Buonasera a tutti e tutte. È un piacere di accogliere Esther DUFLO questa sera, economista.
Welcome, Esther DUFLO, an economist, an innovative economist, a hyperactive one as well. And Mrs. Dr. DUFLO is a professor at the MIT. She has been lecturing there for 7 years, and she studied at the École Économie Paris. She is director and founder of General Poverty Action, and for 1 year she was at the Collège de France, which is one of the most prestigious institutions in France, where in 2009 she inaugurated a chair, Savoir contre Pauvreté. She's the author of various books, in particular 2 books that were published in Italy as well. And she just finished to publish or to write a book in English, which is being published now in the US and which will be published next year in Italy as well. She received an award as the best youngest economist, and in 2010, the prestigious medal John Bates Clark. Well, at the beginning, Esther DUFLO did not deal only with the economics. She was more inclined to historical studies, and working on Soviet Union. She went to Moscow during the perestroika period, where she went to study the 5-year plans, and where she met Daniel Cohen. And it was at that time that she decided to devote her activity to economics, although in a wide sense, in the wide sense of the word. Esther DUFLO was included among the 100 most influential people of 2011 by Time magazine. But what is really important is this new original approach used by Esther DUFLO in the area of the fight against poverty and all its forms, health, microcredit, education. There is more than 1 billion people who still live in poverty in the world. She has a very pragmatic approach, which starts from tangible and simple facts, without any ideological considerations, with a view to looking for pragmatic solutions after experiments on the field. Esther DUFLO challenges preconceived ideas and answers with pragmatism after listening to all the people involved. So she uses applied economics. She goes to the various countries on the field in order to investigate problems and to see whether solutions work. And this after a scientific, systematic assessment. So this is the big contribution made by Esther DUFLO, that is the assessment of poverty plans based on experimental science. And she will tell us about this. And finally, before giving her the floor, I would like to say that one of the characteristics is her dissemination inclination. I spoke about her books earlier, but she's also the founder of the magazine American Journals of Economics. And among the various activities, she, for 10 years, wrote in Libération, a monthly article, where she dealt pragmatically with various fields, the fight against AIDS in Africa, inclusion in the school of migrant children, or there was also an article about the introduction of mobiles in Kerala and how that had helped local fishermen reduce waste and increase their income. So technology and its impact on the fight against poverty. So the floor to you, Esther DUFLO.
Buonasera. That's it for Italian. That was just a test. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. At least I think it was kind. I couldn't really understand it. The debate about poverty in the world very quickly becomes a debate about aid. Quickly enough, it becomes a debate about whether foreign aid can really eradicate poverty or not. And that debate becomes itself a very polarized, a very caricatural debate very quickly. On the one hand, you have Jeffrey Sachs saying that foreign aid on its own can eradicate poverty. In fact, when he wrote this book, The End of Poverty, in 2005, he said that poverty could be eliminated by 2015 if rich countries agreed to spend enough on aid. And in his view, we already knew what to do, we just had to spend the money. It's a question of political will. On the other hand, we have other people like Bill Easterly, who should have been here, unfortunately couldn't be here at this festival, and Dambisa Moyo more recently, claiming that, in fact, aid cannot eradicate poverty. On the contrary, it might be part of the problem rather than being the solution. It creates rents over which people can fight. It also prevents countries to develop their own solution that may be more adapted to their own problems. In their view, the only thing that can help countries and people get out of poverty is freedom, by which they mean both political freedom, but also economic freedom. So this debate becomes a somewhat ideological debate which is related to the theme of this festival, which is how far can economic freedom go in eradicate poverty, and how far could the government go in eradicate poverty. Unfortunately, this debate is not very easily to resolve. We don't have all that many countries. If you look at Africa, Africa got a lot of money over the years in foreign aid, and it didn't become any richer in terms of per capita GDP. So you might think, well, that shows that that aid in Africa was a disaster. But of course, you have no idea what might have happened if Africa didn't get aid. They might have become richer, or they might have become poor, we just don't know. So it's not a debate that we can really easily solve. Another problem with that debate is that it tends to stifle energy, because it focuses attention on eradicating poverty. Like, we have to do the whole thing, and preferably very quickly. And there is about a billion poor people in the world, and that's a lot. And so when people start thinking about poor people in the world, they're thinking this is an immense problem, and what can I possibly do about it? And that makes people scared. And I'll give you the results from an experiment that was conducted by Paul Slovic and his collaborators. So they went to students who were having their lunch at the cafeteria of a business school, Wharton. And they showed them a picture of a girl, a little bit like that, and they said, this is Rokia. She's 7 years old. she's at risk of starvation and dropping out of school, and your donation to Save the Children, that's an organization in the US, can help her. And then they went to another group of people and showed them no picture, but a list of numbers, about 1 million people starving in Angola and Zambia. And again, I asked, will you give some money to Save the Children to help address this problem? And the question was, who is a better fundraiser? It is little Rokia here, or is it the starving million? So we are going to take a vote. So everybody has to vote. I'm not going to have no abstention. Who is the better fundraiser? Is it Rokia? Is it the starving million? No, it's too many abstention. You have to vote. So anyway, Rokia wins, and you're absolutely right. Rokia raised $2.83 from the students, and the starving million raised $1.16. So then they did another experiment. They wanted to know whether, if you made people aware of this bias that we have to give money to an identifiable victim as opposed to giving money to like the entire problem, do you erase the bias? So they again went to 2 groups of students, and first of all they said, you know what, in our previous research, we have noticed that people tend to give more money to an identifiable victim than when confronted to the whole problem. And to another group of students they went, and then they showed them either the Rokia picture or the starving million statistics. So now my question to you is, does that erase the bias to give this little speech first? So erase the bias, let's take a vote. Not erase the bias? Too many people abstain. I need more hands, which were the other. So not erase the bias. Right, so unfortunately you're wrong, because it did erase the bias, but in a somewhat counterproductive way. Which is people didn't start giving money to the starving million, they just stopped giving money to Rokia. So what I think this experiment illustrates is a fundamental characteristic of human beings, which is our first instinct is to be generous. But then we think again, and we think, well, if I give a little bit of money, it's a drop in the bucket, and the bucket probably leaks anyway, so there is really no point trying. And so we just withdraw and start to stop thinking about it. And that's what happened in this experiment. When you make people aware that Rokia is just 1 out of millions, people feel, well, there's nothing I can do. So what a lot of our work, the group of people I'm working with, is to try to go back to thinking about poverty not as one big problem made of starving million or 1 billion people living under $1 a day, but a series of identifiable concrete issues that we can start think about and resolve. In other words, not try to solve the problem of poverty 1 Rokia at a time, but try to solve the problem of poverty 1 problem at a time. And if we start thinking about it that way, then we have time is in our hand. It doesn't really matter. So what I want to do today is to give you a little bit of a flavor of how that works and how we approach the problem and what we learn along the way, maybe things that are not particularly obvious to you that we found in our field work. The first thing that might not be completely obvious to you is that sometimes you can save money by paying people. So a lot of organizations who help the poor feel that it's very important to respect market mechanism in helping the poor. So what they want is that the programs that they are doing can be financially sustainable, that people are willing to pay for them. So in fact, when you're an economist, particularly an economist trained in a little bit of public finance, it's a strange idea because there are things that society wants more than the individuals. And in that case, we should be willing to subsidize the individual to undertake that particular behavior. Immunization is a clear example of that. If I get immunized, that helps me, but that helps you as well, because you're also less likely to get the disease. So, not surprisingly, the international community has been spending a lot of money subsidizing immunization, so particularly the Gavi Alliance and the Gates Foundation. And despite that, something like 25 million children are not immunized every year. That's what you call a last mile problem. The money is there, the infrastructure is there, the vaccines are there, and yet it doesn't happen. So why doesn't it happen? To find that out, we started working in an area in Rajasthan, in northern India, where when we started, 1% of children were fully immunized. That is, they had received the 5 shots that are essential for immunization. And we started wondering, why is that the case? So one thing that is clear is that it's not because they don't care about their children, or that they don't care about health, because the same families who don't immunize their children spend about 7% of their budget on healthcare, which means that the kids are not immunized against measles, but if they do get measles, the family will spend an enormous amount of money trying to solve the problem. So what you have is these empty village sub-centers, but crowded hospitals. So a first problem might be a problem of information. People are just not aware of the problem. So this is not a problem that is only in developing countries. This is a clipping from the New York Times. 300 people diagnosed with mumps in suburban New York, people refusing to take vaccinations, either for religion reason, but also, for example, because they think that the measles vaccine is related with autism. So information is always an issue. But even once you're convinced, you still need to go from intention to action. And going from intention to action in Udaipur district, that means going to this place, that's a sub-center. And what's important about this sub-center is that it is closed. This particular one has been closed every single week. We visited it for a year. On average, the sub-centers are closed about half the time, due to absenteeism of nurses. So that's the first problem. And you would think, well, people would easily get discouraged if every time they go to try and immunize their children, the sub-center is closed. A second problem is that even if the sub-center were open, you could say, well, suppose I don't immunize my child today and I wait till tomorrow. What is the chance that they get measles in the meantime? It's very low. So the cost of postponing for just a day is not that large. And today we are very busy, there is a lot of things we need to do, and it's not very nice to bring a crying child home. So you might think, well, I'm just going to wait till tomorrow. And then tomorrow comes, and you might think, well, I'm going to wait till day after tomorrow, and never end up doing it. So if this is a problem, then you might think, well, one way to try and fix the problem is to give people a reason to act today. And the way we did that is we worked we set up an experiment, very much like an experiment to test the impact of a drug, but to test the impact of these policies. So this is Udaipur district viewed from the sky. We worked in about 120 villages, and we picked randomly 3 groups of villages. The first group of villages, the white one, we did not do anything, left it as usual. In the blue one, an organization we worked with set up monthly immunization camps to make it easy for people. And in the red villages, on top of the monthly immunization camps, people got a kilo of lentil for each immunization for the child. So a kilo of lentil, even in India, it's not a lot of money. So it is not something that is going to convince people if they feel that immunization is dangerous. But if the problem is procrastination, then it will help them. Because it will give them a reason to act today and not to wait till later. And because the experiment was randomized, at the beginning, everything is pretty much the same. After 18 months, the immunization rose in the control villages to about 6%. In the villages where the camp were put in place, it went to 17%. That's already an improvement. But adding the lentil increased immunization by 38%. So that's a huge improvement. So the organization we work with asked us, that's nice, it's a huge improvement, but can we really afford those lentils? It makes the program not sustainable to give people this incentive to do something. So we calculated the cost of immunization, of immunizing a child in the camp villages and in the camp plus incentive. And this is what we found. It actually turns out to be cheaper to give lentils than not to give lentils. So why is that the case? Well, because once you set up a camp, you're paying someone to immunize the children. If she works harder because many more children are coming, then her time is used more effectively. So actually, you end up saving money, even though here, I count the lentils as a cost, whereas in fact, as an economist, I should count it as a transfer, and therefore not even consider that it's a cost. But even counting it as a cost, it ends up being cheaper. So this is important because it tells you a mistake that a lot of organizations and governments do, which is to do the cost-benefit analysis wrong. Sometimes it's actually the most efficient thing to help people about, to do a behavior that you want them to do anyway. Here is another one. Television is more important than food. So where is that coming from? Well, when I was growing up, when I was about 13, was the time of the Live Aid concert. So I was singing We Are the World, and my view of a poor person was someone who was an Ethiopian child with a distended belly. And in that, I was very representative of a lot of people who think essentially someone who is poor is someone who doesn't have enough to eat. And there is this very strong idea that there might be a poverty trap based on nutrition. So the story, the logic of the story is simple. You don't eat enough, so you're not very productive, so you don't make much money, so you don't eat enough, so you're not very productive, so you stay poor. So this is the logic of this is superficially very sensible, but the only problem is that that doesn't appear to be the case. Because if it were true, what we should see is that when poor people get any little extra money, they should immediately try and buy more calories, more of the same food, in order to become more productive and try to escape poverty this way. And what we find is, in some sense, exactly the opposite. Here's India. India is becoming richer and richer over time. People clearly like food there. And as India is becoming richer, there are fewer and fewer poor people. Fewer and fewer people live under $1 a day. So you would expect that there are fewer and fewer people who are undernourished. And what you find, this is research by Angus Deaton, is exactly the opposite, which is more and more people eat less than 2,400 calories a day. In 1983, 66% of people ate less than 2,400 calories a day, which is a threshold for decent nutrition. And by 2004, it was almost 80%. Yet people are not exactly complaining. They are not reporting lack of food. They are less likely to report lack of food. So the problem of nutrition in India exists. People don't eat enough calories. They also don't get enough micronutrients like iron. But it's not a hunger problem. It's a nutrition problem. And it's not a problem of constraint. It's a problem of choice. And here is another experiment that makes this even clearer, that the way we're thinking about food policy might be completely wrong. This is an experiment from that Rob Jensen and Nolan Miller carried out in China. And what they did is a program which is very much like the type of programs that we see to help the poor worldwide, which is trying to make food cheaper. So they went around and ran an experiment where they distributed people vouchers for discount on the price of rice in a region where people mostly eat rice. So when the price of rice went down by 10%, people started eating less rice. The rice consumption dropped by 2.3%. So for the economists here, it means rice is a given good, something which, until this experiment, most of us thought was probably an urban legend, something that did not really exist. But aside from this, what is very important is that this type of policies, making food cheaper, is the way that we're trying to get the poor to eat more. In fact, what is happening when you make the basic food cheaper is because rice is such an important part of the budget, it makes people feel a bit richer. Then what do they do with the money? Well, they spend it on things that they like, which turns out not to be rice, obviously, which turns out to be shrimps, to some extent, and other things, like cell phone minutes, to some extent. So that doesn't mean we shouldn't be worried necessarily about the nutrition issue. For example, in India, about half the children are stunted, and that's very bad for their long-run productivity. But it means we need to worry about it in a way that respects the fact that the poor are not machines. They are not maximizing physical fitness, they're maximizing utility, and we need to take into account those preferences when constituting policies, which is very rarely the case, and is certainly not the case as far as food is concerned, where what food policy means in most countries is dumping grains on people, which seems to be counterproductive, if this example tells us anything. Here is another one that I think is very relevant to the theme of this festival, is this idea that there are very many entrepreneurs in the developing world. And the great virtue of the microcredit movement, and to some extent of the social business movement, which has been kind of supplanted it, right now is the idea that, oh, the poor, they are so entrepreneurial, they can lift themselves out of poverty, we don't need to give them anything, we just need to give them access to credit, and then they'll take themselves out of poverty. So this is based on something which is quite real, which is the poor are very often entrepreneurs in the very specific sense that they do run their own business. Across 18 countries where we've collected data, 50% of the urban poor operate a business, and something like 20% of the rural poor also operate a non-farm business. On top of that, a large number of them have a farm. If you compare this to the OECD number, the number in the OECD is closer to 12%. So is this really telling you, indeed, the poor are all entrepreneurs? The one wrinkle is that even though they run small businesses, sometimes more than one, that's not something that they seem to be particularly happy to do. And one way you can see that is by asking them what they would like their kids to do. And we've been asking this question in several countries in the world. This is a question, this is the answer for Udaipur, the same place where we did the vaccine experiment. 18% of them would like their sons to be an employee in a private firm. A little over 40% would like them to have a non-teaching government job. And 34% of them would like them to be a government teacher. None of them said that they would like their sons to be an entrepreneur. What these numbers tell you is what people aim for, what people would really like and dream for their children is stability. It's the exact opposite of the life of non-stability that they have. So then you might be wondering, well, if everybody wants to be an employee, why aren't there some firms that actually employ these people? Why do people have to run their own businesses? And the reason, of course, is that there are no jobs to be had. So what people do, with or without a microcredit loan, is to start a very small firm, because they are, in some sense, buying themselves a job. So how come you have all these tiny firms, and they're not managing to grow into larger firms that start hiring more people? So what we think is happening is something like that, which is, this is a production function. So the beginning of it is quite well known as a well-known shape. There is diminishing return to capital, with maybe very high return at the beginning, but it flattens out. So imagine you start a shop, you clean up a room, you buy some shelves, and then you have nothing. So if I start giving you a little bit of money to start to get goods, then you're going to have a high productivity of these goods. Eventually, your shelves are going to be full, however, and then that's it. If you wanted to become bigger, you would need to start hiring people, that would need to be complicated. There is a next jump. So if you don't have this next jump, things flatten out. Of course, if things flattened out so quickly after relatively low investment, then you would have no large firms. So we know there are large firms, even in countries like India. So what is happening is that there is another production function out there. There is this QR production function, which requires a much larger investment upfront. So for example, instead of starting one shop in your room, you kind of open a little retail store. And that larger investment, if you make it, then there is more scope for improving for increasing the size of your business at a high level of productivity. The problem is that if you're very poor, no one is going to lend you enough money to make it worthwhile to choose this new, better production technology. So if you're very poor, you're going to be stuck in the kind of businesses that really never really grow past some level. And where we have a big thing, we have a big missing middle over there, where there is kind of lots and lots of very, very small firms, and very few of these larger firms that manage to actually hire people and get a more stable kind of employment for people. This also tells us why the debate on microcredit is so flawed. So the whole hope of microcredit was give a little bit of money to the poor, and they'll progressively pull themselves out of poverty by their own bootstrap. And we see how it wouldn't happen here, because they would get stuck on M. Even if the microcredit was actually very nice for them, very helpful, it helps them get to M, which is already something. So it is not that microcredit is either useless or fantastic. Microcredit is very helpful, but it's very helpful to go from O to M, and it's not very helpful for most people to escape poverty. And that debate is just never going on. The debate is stuck between microcredit is either the best thing since sliced bread or a complete disaster, which is more the situation that more the general position now, unfortunately. And what you can see from this graph how an invention like microcredit could have its use without being the way that you would have a lot of people escaping poverty. To have a lot of people escaping poverty, you need to fix the next problem, which is how do we get sufficient amount of money into the hands of people who are capable to start a farm? And that's a much harder problem, and not one that has been solved so far. Here is another one that's sort of the new fashionable thing now that microcredit is so 20th century, is insurance. And the idea of insurance seems pretty obvious. On the one hand, the poor suffer from tremendous amount of risk because they run their own business, because they have a farm. So imagine, for example, that there is a drought, then you're kind of, this is a disaster, or you become sick, or you have an accident. Then your entire world shatters. And the risk is not only costly once it hits, it's also costly in anticipation. These people over here, they are farmers in Kenya, and they grow maize. And what's remarkable about the maize they grow is that it's traditional maize, not hybrid maize. And the reason why they grow traditional maize and not hybrid maize, one of the reasons is that hybrid maize is more risky. And they feel like they can't afford this kind of risk. So given that, you would think, well, then the insurance company should jump on this. The poor need the risk. Someone could go and find them and sell them insurance, and they would be happy and make money, and they also would be better off. So that's a place for the market to come in. So it's not really happening. So you might wonder why. Well, the reason is that the demand for the products that the insurance company can offer is actually quite low. And here is an example from an experiment that Dean Carl and Chris Udry conducted in Ghana. What they tried to do is to sell a very conventional weather insurance product. Basically, if the rainfall at the nearby weather station falls below some threshold, the policy pays you. So the reason why it's an attractive product is because there is no reason to go to your farm and check anything. So this is robust to moral hazard, this is robust to adverse selection, this is not very expensive to administer. So that should be a product that is really a win-win. Well, when it's offered for free, so what they did is one of these experiments again, when they go to see various people and offer it at various prices. So when it is offered for free, 100% of people want it. That's reassuring. It would be a bit worrisome if people didn't want it when it's free. But as soon as you start charging, people are less enthusiastic. In particular, the actuarially fair price is 9.5 Ghana cedi per acre. That's what you need to charge to, in expectation, not lose money. And at 9.5 Ghana cedi per acre, 40% of farmers buy the policy. In addition, you have some administrative costs, and you also need to make a little bit of money. So the insurance company would like to charge 14 Ghana cedi per acre. And if they charge 14 Ghana cedi per acre, 8% of people want to buy the policy. That is too few farmers to even bother. So why is it that no one wants to buy a product that seems to make so much sense? And the reason, we think, is precisely because the product is so simple. The only product that the insurance companies are able to offer, because of the problem of adverse selection, moral hazard, and administrative, and the risk of frauds, are very simple, basic products. So for weather, it is this product, parametric weather insurance. For health, it is catastrophic health insurance, like hospitalization policy, not outpatient care. So from the point of view of the poor, this is not a very attractive product because it is full of holes. So imagine, for example, this farmer, his field is completely dry. He's still not going to get any payment if it turns out that in the weather station, the rainfall was actually just above the threshold. And since there are not that many weather stations, there is a lot of variation within what's happening in a weather station. So from his point of view, what we are trying to sell him is an additional lottery. It's something which has to pay for and may or may not pay him in the state where he needs it. Of course, if he was fully informed and rational, he would see that it's a good lottery because it is a lottery that is more likely to pay when you need it. But the way he sees it is, look, I already have this incredibly risky life, and you're asking me to buy another lottery ticket. You must be fallen on your head. In addition, there are problems of trust, and when he's not paid, he's always wondering whether it's because something fishy that did or something like that. So as a result, the demand for the product that the market is in a position to offer is actually quite limited. So what do we do? Well, one possibility is to say, fine, at the market price, the demand is very limited. The government could subsidize. They don't need to go out and offer the insurance themselves, but they could say, we are going to subsidize the premium to some level, at least for a while, as people get used to how this thing works. Here's the last thing I want to say, which is important to conclude, which is the voice of the poor is often ignored, but not for very strong reasons. The reason why I want to conclude on this example is because when I present the type of work that I just presented today, in a lot of cases people say, yes, that's fine, that's interesting. You're like an engineer more than an economist. You take a problem and fix it. That's nice. But really, you're missing the big picture. The big picture is the politics. If the politics is good, policies will follow. If the politics is bad, policies will never follow. In other words, you can think about immunizing children, but right now in Côte d'Ivoire, the reason why children are not immunized has nothing to do with procrastination or information. It is because the whole country is in the middle of a civil war. So at some level, of course, I don't disagree that politics is important. But there are two things I want to say. The first one is that politics doesn't happen in a vacuum. Politics is not the magic way in which the will of the people transform or doesn't transform into a set of policy recommendations. Politics is also a set of rules and institutions which are often very detailed. And the details of this institution, how they operate on the ground, makes a huge amount of difference. So I'll show you one example of that. It's an example for Brazil. Brazil is a pro-poor, big pro-poor democracy. So we know that the big politics is fixed there. So here is what you have to do if you want to vote in Brazil. First, you have to vote because voting is mandatory. So you go to the voting pool, and this is your ballot. So for those who were in America some years ago, this is a butterfly ballot. There are two sides to it. So to vote for your prefeito, it's not that hard. You need to tick the right place in the right column. To vote for your vereador, you need to find a long list of names, find out who you want to vote for, and write down their names or their number without mistake. So Thomas Fujiwara, graduate student at the University of British Columbia, studied what happened when this system was replaced by an electronic voting system. So this is what they did. In order to make it easier to count the vote, they introduced these little voting machines. So now if you want to vote for someone, you punch their numbers and a picture of the person you want to vote for appears. Now, if you didn't want to vote for them, you can change, or if it's no one, then it will come as a mistake, you can also change. As a result of this policy, 11% more votes, when it was introduced, 11% more votes were valid. It was first introduced in larger cities, so you can compare the large city to the less large city. 11% more votes were valid. Who are these votes? These voters whose vote was invalid before? Mainly the poor, of course, because they are the ones who couldn't vote. The result is that they elected different representatives. Representatives with lower education level were elected. These representatives took different policy decisions. In particular, they spent more on health care, which is pro-poor in Brazil because all the rich have their own private health insurance. And that changes people's lives in a very important way. The birth rate improved among the poor. So all of that to say that this is, in a sense, this is, again, another technical fix. You would think something maybe not very important compared to large things like democracy or the will of the people. But this is how democracy works in practice. Democracy is not all that different from anything else. The other thing I want to say, and that's the other importance of politics, is that it is true that politics matters, but within a set of institutions, the details of how people's general preferences are translated into laws and regulation makes a huge amount of difference. A lot of the policies in the world that are meant to help the poor people fail, not because of some big conspiration against them, but because of what, with my colleague Abhijit Banerjee, we call 3I problem. Ideology, ignorance, and inertia. You have policies that are designed in ideology, starting with some cartoon character view of what the poor are and what their problem is. Like, for example, they are starving or they are entrepreneurial or what have you, which are sustained in ignorance of their conditions on the ground and persist out of sheer inertia. So I'll give you just one example to close of that. This is India, another big pro-poor democracy. We were interested in looking at the effect of the village education committees. The village education committees have been introduced all over India inspired by the ideology that the poor need to be and want to and are able to participate in the control of the education of schools in their villages. That's fine, that seems like a nice idea. So every single village in India has a village education committee. We went to those to ask to the ministry, to the bureaucrats actually, how they decided who was going to be on the village education committee. And they told us, you have the parents of the best performing child in the school, the parents of the lowest performing child in the school, and the parent of the handicapped child. And then we asked, how do you know who is the best performing child in the school, since you've just abolished exams? And then big silence, and we quickly shifted the conversation to something else. So we went to the villages and asked people what they knew about those committees. 8% of parents knew that the committee existed. 2% of parents knew what they were supposed to do. And the kicker, perhaps, is that 25% of the committee members had no idea that they were committee members. So needless to say, this is a policy that has no effect whatsoever. And it is not because there is a conspiracy from the elite in the village to keep the poor out. It's none of that. It is because the policy was never set alive, never got a life on the ground. So at some level, this is a bit depressing to think that, oh, so much waste around. At some level, it's actually quite encouraging. Because if the problem is mainly that in a lot of cases we've not taken the trouble to figure out how things were in practice, to try things out, to evaluate them rigorously, and to scrap them if they don't work, then we can just start doing them. And this is a message that, in my view, is a message of hope, because it means we can do much, much better. In other words, my very strong belief is that there are piles and piles of dollar bills on the ground, which are coming from generic incompetence at all levels, and that we can just try and do things a little bit better with not even much effort. It's also a message of responsibility, because it also means there is no hiding behind the problem is too difficult, the problem is too big, it's not a problem for me. Everyone can play their own little bit. If people have money to give to an organization, they can choose an organization whose programs have been evaluated and work. If someone is a teacher in a school in India, they can try to teach to the kids that they have in the school and not to some curriculum. If someone is a bureaucrat, they can also probably improve things. So everyone at their level can sort of make a little bit of difference now. And once you realize that, then in some sense the whole debate of whether we can eradicate poverty or not does not hugely matter. Because the whole point is to get started. The whole point is to get started to fix one problem at a time, trying to identify first what the problem is. Not try to find a problem that fits to our solution, but try to find a solution that fits to the problem. Try it out, and if it doesn't work, try something else and move on. Thank you.
I thank very much Esther DUFLO for this conference. We have quite 20 minutes, 30 minutes for the questions. Please, I give you. Vi do la parola, scusate se avete delle domande a Esther DUFLO. Se no, io avrei già un.
Well, I have a question. For many years, the fight against poverty has been connected with the demographics, the birth rate. What is the importance of this parameter today?
Pendant longtemps, on a expliqué que la démographie et le taux de natalité étaient un des facteurs essentiels dans la pauvreté. Qu'en est-il?
That's a very interesting, very important question. I think there are two aspects of this question. Is one, to what extent is demography and high natality rate a problem, both for poverty but also for the environment? And the other is, suppose it is, why is it the case that people choose to have such large families? Or do they choose it, or do they have the large families because they don't know better? And what are their incentives, and does it hurt them at an individual level? I don't really know the answer to the first question. I think in doubt, it is probably worth thinking that it would probably be better if the population stopped climbing so fast. But I don't think we have huge amount of evidence, but there are clearly pressures on resources, on natural resources such as water and climate. On the second question, what is striking is that at an individual level, it is not that clear that having large families make people poor. At an individual level, it is also not clear that people have large families because they don't know better. When you look at the details, people seem to be quite smart about the number of children that they choose to have. And in particular, they have a lot of children in part because they need the labor, in part because there is this risk that they don't know how many of them will survive, and they don't know how many of them will work out. And they are worried about what's going to happen to me and when I become old. Who is going to take care of me? And I think what this leads us to is to think, well, if high population rate is a problem, the way to think about it is maybe the right answer is less a population policy, a traditional population policy involving dumping a lot of contraceptives on people, but more like an economic policy in trying to change the incentives for people to align the private incentive a little bit better with the social incentive. Right now, the private incentive is still to have many children, and it could be different if there was other ways to ensure your survival in old age.
Prego, signora.
Mi pare che lei ci confermi quello che è stato detto mi pare che lei ci confermi.
Can you hear me? So, apparently you are confirming what was said recently in a meeting at the University of Trento some time ago. Well, we too, up to some time ago, thought that it was enough to have a lot of aids and concentrate aids in a place in order to resolve the problem. So don't you think that it should be important to have connections with humanitarian organizations, voluntary organizations, church organizations, in order to bring cultural aid, economic aid, in order to guide these people and involve these people. So I think that this is what I learned from you. And do you think that we should have these networks of different organizations?
Well, I think you're exactly right, that the question that matters is not so much whether aid is good or bad, but what works, what program is effective and what program is not effective, irrespective of who is paying for it. If the aid is paying for it, or an NGO is paying for it, or the government is paying for it with their own budget, what matters is that the policy is a good policy. It is what is important. And you're right that, I run a lab called Jamil Poverty Action Lab, where we work with a number of NGOs to try and help them evaluate the impact of their programs. And we are trying to extend the number of people we work with, and I think that has proved quite effective and important.
Intanto buonasera.
Well, good evening and congratulations. I work in a voluntary association. I did the war, the Second World War, so I'm pretty old. Well, I say that in order to fight poverty, we should involve governments. De Gasperi went to America to ask for help in order to resolve the poverty of Italy. And then what about health? Health is life. Life means work, and work means income. So health is a fundamental principle.
So even in Africa, aid represents only 5.7% of the budget of the governments. So even in Africa, aid is a pretty small part of the entire story. So you're absolutely right that governments need to be involved. That the fact of the matter is we have to design, collectively the world has to design and find out good policies. And this is how we need to make progress. And aid can help, and I'm all in favor of aid, and I think we should give more money. Once we know how to give it, I think it's both a moral obligation from the rich countries and something which makes a lot of sense, because that can maintain some equilibrium in the world. So I think we could spend more money once we know what to spend it on, and we should. On the second part of your question, which was health, I couldn't agree more, which is why I spoke about immunization. Health is, in a sense, a field of great promises and great frustration. The promise is that there are a number of things that we know work, that doctors have shown us work, like immunizing children, sleeping under a bed net, drinking clean water, have tremendous effect on income of people in the future. That's the promise part. The frustration part is that why aren't those technologies taken advantage of more often? So we are busy developing new vaccines, and in the meantime, in Rajasthan, 1% of kids get immunized. So the question becomes, how do you change the system and the health policies such that the majority of people can benefit from the existing health technology, and of course all the future one we're going to invent.
Prego.
Sì, allora io...
Well, I had the opportunity of visiting Ethiopia, and I met masses of young people, many young people. So my question is, these tens of millions of young people, so do we have hope that they have some life prospect? And I'm referring to a life which is worth living. I'm asking that because we in the West go for excessive consumerism made of SUVs and Mercedes and Rolls-Royces, and we consume so many resources that we steal from them. So the question is, do you think that these millions of young people really can expect a decent life given the situation that we have?
the short answer is yes. The longer answer is, per se, having a lot of young people can be an asset. I mean, you can call it a demographic, they call it sometimes the demographic dividend. If you compare India and China now, China has grown more historically, but now China is aging because they were so effective in reducing fertility. And India is full of people who are in the age of 14, 20, but also 25 and 30, who are the ones who are going to be productive in the future. So the big question becomes, can you find a way to, for these people to do something helpful? And I think a key part of it is going to be education. And one of the problems of developing countries today is that although a lot of children go to school, and the school systems don't deliver very much to them. The quality of education is low. About half of the kids finish primary school and cannot recognize a simple paragraph. And that, of course, limits a lot their chance to make a living. And so I think a key issue that is in front of poor countries now is what to do, in particular with respect, as far as the youth population is concerned, is how to improve quite quickly the quality of education. And I think the good news is that we have a little bit of a sense of how to do that, particularly at the primary level. The less good news is that that's not really implemented in any large scale, and therefore there is some reforms that needs to be made in a lot of countries. And also that what's going to happen to secondary school is a little bit more up in the air. Which is, as these kids become adolescents and all go to secondary school, it's a little bit harder to have good quality secondary education. You need more educated teachers, and these teachers presumably have other things to do with their time. And so I think a big question mark and a very interesting problem to think about is how can you do secondary education for a very large number of people, maintaining the quality while keeping the budget of secondary school in check. And that's for a country like Ethiopia, but also like India, is, I think, one of the challenges ahead.
Prego, in fondo. Grazie.
Your research showed that the entrepreneurship is not a solution itself for the poverty. Actually, I'm surprised that 50% from the urban poor are entrepreneurs, but I suppose that are scientific data. What do you think about the social entrepreneurship regarding the reduction of the poverty? I'm asking you because this region, Trentino, is known that in history, in the end of 19th century, solved somehow this problem of poverty by appealing at this solution of social economy, and it's well known as like one of the largest developed cooperative sector, I suppose, in the world, maybe.
I suppose I would need to understand. I haven't fully understood what social entrepreneurship means, because it means different things to different people. So I'm going to answer the question. I hope it's your question, but I'm not entirely sure. The idea of social entrepreneurship is the idea that you can have, so to speak, a double bottom line. So you can make money, or at least not lose money, and at the same time do something that is actually helpful, that is helpful for poor people. So for example, you could start a little factory that produces nutritional supplements and then sell the nutritional supplement to the people, so kids would be better nourished and at the same time would make some money. So I think that's a solution which is extremely attractive. And like everything that is extremely attractive, it has a danger of being almost like too attractive. Which is, I think there are cases where it is true that a market is missing, and someone could come up and try and work in this market and fix the missing, plug the missing market by figuring out some new system. And I think microcredit is a beautiful example of that, where most microcredit organizations make money, or at least don't lose money, and at the same time they deliver something which I'm still convinced has value. On the other hand, the danger with the social entrepreneurship movement, the way that you hear about it today, is sometimes you have a sense that they think that they can solve every single problem in this way. And they are forgetting the problem of demand. That if you're trying to provide something for which the demand is not there, you're not going to make money. And there are things that society wants to do, should be done from a social welfare perspective, but that the individual demand is lower. So for example, no one, I can predict that, no one would make money trying to immunize people. And yet we need to immunize people. So social entrepreneurship is not about to fix the problem of immunization. Things that are maybe less obvious is clean water. You would think, well, could I make money trying to sell water filter to people? Well, at the moment, you would not make money trying to sell water filter to people. You would lose money because it costs some amount to produce the water filter, and the demand for quality of water, for some reason, is very low. People are not willing to pay a lot for having clean water. So you see that, so you think, why are they not willing to pay a lot? That's a complicated story that I'm not going to get into right now, but that's the fact of the matter. So does it mean that we should not worry about providing clean water? Of course it doesn't mean that, but it means that it will need to be subsidized. Then of course it can still be provided by a social entrepreneur, but there will need to be a contribution of society to make that happen. So I think one need to be creative, which is one need to say, well, if there is a missing market and there is a market solution to that problem, by all means, we should put it in place, but we shouldn't live under the illusion that every single problem can be solved in this way.
Prego.
Thank you, Esther. It was really a great lesson today. I understand that you are proposing a more scientific approach to policy, trial and errors, and thinking about which policies work and which don't work, and scrap those that don't work, which seems an important, message to give. On the other hand, I'm a little bit worried about whether there are general lessons that we can sort of learn, in the sense that there is heterogeneity in the plans, there is heterogeneity in the policies, but there is heterogeneity also in the population, in the places. Social networks are different, and different ethnic fragmentation, languages, costumes, beliefs, and so this will make trying everything on everybody, an order of magnitude more difficult. So from your experience, is it enough to see that, I don't know, there is particular, well, today we talked about failures for the most, but suppose there was some successful story somewhere. Can we learn that that is going to work also in some number of other countries, some other realities, or we need to go one by one? Yeah, that's my question.
So at some level, it can't be the case that that every single person is so specific that they need to have their own little set of policies on their own, or every single village. Otherwise, the whole concept of policy would go away. So as long as you acknowledge that policy is a sensible world, then you acknowledge that the heterogeneity is manageable, that I can learn something about you that is relevant to your neighbor. Now, of course, there are limits to that. And for example, it seems intuitive that if we give school uniforms in Kenya and they do help kids stay in school longer, that policy might not work in Norway. So we know that there are limits to what generalizes, what doesn't, in program evaluation as in policy. So there are two ways to go about this problem, or this issue. One is replicating experiments. So in a lot of cases, once we start having confidence that something works, it's because something has been tried in some context that's sufficiently different that it makes sense to try the thing. Then the second part of the answer is that the experiment is never sufficient on its own. The experiment is only always a data point in some kind of a theory that you have, which can be explicit or which can be implicit. Often in academic journalism, it's explicit, in policy discourse, it's implicit. And in a sense, that's why we, for example, with Abhijit, in the book Poor Economics that just came out, we try to go one step further from just evaluating, from putting things next to each other or something in my previous book, and to say, well, think of each experiment as one data point or one touch of paint. And not only experiments, actually, also like simple, descriptive statistics, like means and stuff like that. They progressively amount to some kind of a painting, which gives us an idea of what is the structure of the problem and things like that. And it is that painting that gives you a sense of that makes you able to predict what is likely to work as a function of the features of the context. So the experiment on its own is just a data point. It's not because the sun rises every morning to the east that you're sure that it's going to work again tomorrow. Once you know that for a couple of times, you form a theory for what's happening with the movement of the sun and the earth. That's the same thing in social policy, but it helps. And also, once you form predictions, then you can test them by running new experiments. You get some feedback on what your theory is. So you have this kind of constant process of induction and deduction. Sometimes the data is a bit ahead of the theory, and sometimes the theory is a bit ahead of the data, but they keep kind of talking to each other.
Un'ultima breve domanda.
A last brief question. I'm sorry, but it is so late.
I have two very brief questions. The first one is related on insurance. While you talked about risks, correct me if I'm wrong, but you suggested that governments should subsidize in order to deal with the premiums. Now, my question is, we all know that subsidies often are criticized because they create some sort of dependency. So how do you evaluate these projects as becoming sustainable if they continue receiving subsidies from governments? And the other issue is regarding insurance. I don't know if in your experiments you're able to find anything on informal insurance mechanisms in these developing countries. Thank you.
So for the first question, two answers. One is that I think, as I said at the beginning, I think there are things that we should be willing to subsidize forever and ever and ever. And there are things that we are subsidizing forever and ever and ever. In immunization, for example, is free and compulsory in this country. We are very rich already. People could afford the cost of immunization. We consider that immunization should be subsidized because the social benefits is larger than the private benefits. And I think it is very dangerous, this idea that everything needs to pay for itself. We are not this is, if we're thinking of policy, we're thinking from the perspective of the government. We are not like a person trying to manage their budget. We are thinking about the whole social welfare. And things don't have to pay for themselves one by one by one. What needs to be sustainable is the whole society. So that's one. So if it turns out that insurance, like health insurance, for example, needs to be subsidized until kingdom comes, then let it be, because health is something which is whether it's contagion, something where, if someone is very, very sick and goes to a hospital, that costs us a lot of money. So, what's the problem with subsidizing? So that's answer number one. Answer number two, for the particular case of insurance, I do think that there is a learning process that needs to happen, which is, I don't know it for a fact, but I think that people could learn a little bit better how insurance works, what it does, what it doesn't do. It's not an intuitive concept at all. And therefore, if you started by subsidizing it, it is possible that people's valuation of the insurance product would increase, and therefore you would be able to reduce the subsidy. People would learn from their neighbors, people would learn from their own news, etc. And you could experiment with it very simply by subsidizing insurance very heavily in some places and not some other, and then see what happens over time. And an experiment very much like that was done for subsidizing bed nets. We showed those effects, where that over time you can reduce the subsidy more if you started with a very heavy subsidy, because people have learned the use of bed nets. So I could envision something where it's not that people will get used to handouts, it's that they will get used to insurance, which would be good. About informal insurance, yes, there is a tremendous amount of work on informal insurance, very interesting, very important. It's necessarily limited because it's geographically limited in general. So it's, to start with, can't deal with aggregate shocks. And it's also limited in its scope because it's usually made of bilateral relationship, one-to-one relationship, and so people are not able to handle a huge shock. So what we see, for example, is people are much better insured by their friends for small things, and not very well for like a health catastrophe. So the informal insurance is better at dealing with the kind of day-to-day problems and not very well at dealing at catastrophic situation, where you would want to have some formal, possibly subsidized insurance.
Bene, vi ringrazio tantissimo e soprattutto.
Well, thank you very much. I would like really to thank Esther DUFLO for coming to Trento today. It was a pleasure having you here, and thank you for taking so many questions.